The world remembers Nelson Mandela as the smiling statesman who walked out of prison after 27 years and turned bitterness into reconciliation. A man whose name became shorthand for courage, sacrifice, and forgiveness. Yet behind the iconic photographs and the grand speeches, there was a father whose own family life was scarred by absence, secrecy, and grief. A man who watched the Mandela name echo across the globe, while his children carried that same name in very different, often painful ways. He led a nation into democracy, but he could not attend his eldest son's funeral. He became a symbol of hope, even as disease, exile, and political struggle cut through his own family tree. Mandela married 3 times, first to nurse Evelyn Mase, with whom he had 4 children, and later to social worker and anti-apartheid firebrand Winnie Madikizela, with whom he had 2 more. Those 6 children were born into a world shaped by colonial rule, rising resistance, and eventually, the full machinery of apartheid. Their childhoods unfolded in crowded township houses, in the shadow of police raids, bannings, and whispered meetings. And then, after 1962, under the long, cold absence created by their father's imprisonment on Robben Island. Some would grow into diplomats and business leaders, stepping deliberately into public life. Others would die young, their lives cut short by car accidents, illness, or the long, grinding stresses of a family caught in the crossfire of history. To the outside world, Mandela's family looked like an extension of his myth. Living proof that the struggle had produced not only a new South Africa, but a powerful dynasty. The reality was far more complicated. The children grew up negotiating 2 kinds of distance at once. Physical distance from a father kept behind bars for decades, and emotional distance from a man whose first allegiance had to remain the movement he served. Some resented that gap. Some tried to fill it. Some spent years simply trying to build ordinary lives while everyone else insisted they were extraordinary. Even the basic facts of their lives were filtered through politics. The death of a son became a state secret. The careers of his daughters were read as symbols of a country's progress, long before anyone asked what they themselves actually wanted. This story is not just about Nelson Mandela, the father of the nation. It is about 6 very different lives pulled into the orbit of that towering figure. 6 children who inherited not only his surname, but the costs and expectations that came with it. From the child who never reached her first birthday, to the daughter who would become a high-profile diplomat. From the son whose death haunted Mandela's years in prison, to the child who chose a quieter, more private path. Each of them reveals another side of a man the world thinks it already knows. In this countdown, we will move from number 6 to number 1, tracing how each of Nelson Mandela's 6 children was shaped by his struggle and by their own choices, how their lives unfolded in the harsh light of history, and in some cases, in the softer shadows far away from the cameras. Together, their stories form a family portrait filled not with slogans, but with contradictions. Love and resentment, pride and pain, public glory and private loss. Number 6. Magatho Mandela. Number 6 is Magatho Mandela, Nelson Mandela's youngest child with his first wife, Evelyn. Born in 1950, he entered the world during a moment of tightening repression in South Africa. As the apartheid state began to harden and the African National Congress moved increasingly toward underground resistance. Magatho grew up in Soweto during years of political surveillance and police raids, shaping a childhood marked by fear, secrecy, and a father whose presence was increasingly claimed by the struggle. When Mandela went underground in the early 1960s and was later arrested, Magatho's life changed abruptly. His father disappeared into the machinery of the state, and the boy was left to navigate adolescence in a household fractured by politics, separation, and grief. Magatho came of age while Mandela was held on Robben Island, a son who had to learn manhood without the guidance of the man South Africa would later revere. His mother, Evelyn, lived a largely private life after separating from Mandela, and Magatho followed a similar pattern. Quiet, deliberate, and far less public than his siblings, he avoided the media and built a life outside the political arena that had consumed his father. He worked in business, kept close ties with extended family, and remained a relatively unpublicized figure even during the dramatic years of South Africa's transition to democracy. Unlike his sisters or half-sisters, Magatho rarely appeared at rallies or national events. His path diverged from the symbolic expectations placed on the Mandela name. The turning point in Magatho's story came in his final years. In 2005, he died at the age of 54 from an AIDS-related illness, leaving behind children of his own. His death confronted Nelson Mandela with a personal tragedy that echoed the losses of earlier decades, but it also pressed him into yet another public role, breaking the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS in South Africa. Mandela stood before the world and declared the cause of his son's death, insisting that silence was far deadlier than the disease itself. It was a moment that fused private grief with public responsibility, a moment that added a new layer to Mandela's moral authority. Magatho Mandela was buried in Johannesburg, remembered by those who knew him as measured, thoughtful, and far more devoted to privacy than to the political legacy that surrounded his family name. His life lacked the public drama associated with the Mandela story, yet his death reshaped national discourse and allowed his father to lead South Africa into a conversation the country had long avoided. In that sense, Magatho left a legacy not of speeches or offices, but of courage through vulnerability. A chapter in the Mandela family story, written not in triumph, but in truth. Number 5. Phumla Makaziwe. Mandela number 5 is Phumla Makaziwe-Mandela, known as Maki, the daughter of Nelson Mandela and his first wife Evelyn. Born in 1954, she entered a world already trembling under the early machinery of apartheid. At a time when her father was dividing his energy between the courtroom, the liberation movement, and a home strained by political tension, Maki grew up in Orlando West, Soweto, where the sound of police vans and political meetings became the background music of her childhood. She learned early that her father's path would never allow him to be simply a parent, and that the world outside her door carried its own dangers. Unlike many of her siblings, Maki's childhood was marked by stability in one area: education. She showed early academic promise, and even as the political climate deteriorated, she pursued her studies with discipline and clarity. After completing school at Waterford Kamplaba in Swaziland, she earned a degree from the University of Fort Hare before leaving South Africa to pursue postgraduate studies in the United States. Her academic journey culminated in a PhD in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts, a rare achievement for a Black South African woman of her generation. The distance from home offered perspective. She could see the struggle more clearly, yet she also saw the personal sacrifices embedded in her father's choices. Her turning point came after returning to South Africa in the final years of apartheid. While many expected her to step into a visible political role, Maki chose a different direction. She built a career in business, higher education, and development work, serving on corporate boards and participating in initiatives aimed at economic transformation. In doing so, she shaped a path defined not by rallies or political rhetoric, but by strategy, structure, and long-term investment. She understood that a new South Africa needed engineers of systems as much as it needed icons of resistance. Throughout adulthood, Maki spoke candidly about the emotional costs of growing up with a father imprisoned for the freedom of a nation. She rejected romanticized depictions of the Mandela family, insisting that the world acknowledge both the triumphs and the wounds that came from decades of separation. Yet she carried the Mandela name with dignity, using education and leadership, rather than political inheritance, as her tools for influence. Today, Maki stands as one of the most enduring figures among Mandela's children, a woman who has lived through every phase of South Africa's transformation. Her legacy is grounded not in symbolism, but in intellect and perseverance. A reminder that the struggle for freedom shaped not just revolutionaries, but also thinkers, reformers, and builders who have continued the work in quieter but equally essential ways. Number 4. The first Madikizela-Mandela, the child who never grew up. Number 4 is one of the quietest and yet most sorrowful chapters in Nelson Mandela's family history. His first daughter with Evelyn Mase, the first Madikizela-Mandela, born in 1947 and named after Nelson Mandela's sister. She lived for only 9 months before passing away. Her short life is often overshadowed by the towering political events of the era. But in truth, her death shaped the emotional landscape of the Mandela household in ways that would echo for decades. She was born at a time when Mandela was still a young, rising lawyer in Johannesburg, working long hours defending African clients, facing the tightening grip of institutional racism. The Mandela home was modest, the political climate increasingly tense, and the family far from financially secure. Yet, in those first months, this child brought a rare pause to Mandela's life, a moment when he could imagine a future defined by family rather than struggle. Her mother, Evelyn, often recalled how deeply this loss affected the household. How their daughter's passing carved a quiet space of grief into a marriage already strained by political duty and long absences. Her death marked a turning point. It came just as Mandela's activism intensified, as meetings grew more secretive, and the apartheid regime escalated its surveillance. Losing an infant in the middle of that storm added pressure to a marriage that would soon fracture under the demands of the struggle. Mandela rarely spoke about his first daughter publicly, but in later reflections he acknowledged that his political path had forced him into impossible choices. Choices that carried heavy costs, beginning with a child he could not protect. Although she left no public legacy, the first Madikizela remains an essential piece of the Mandela story. Her name would later be given to another daughter, a sign of remembrance and continuity. And in the quiet absence she left behind, we see the beginnings of a pattern that ran through the Mandela family for years to come. Children growing up in the shadow of a father, claimed by history, not by home. Number 3. Madiba Thembekile, Thembi. Mandela number 3 is Madiba Thembekile-Mandela, known simply as Thembi, Nelson Mandela's first son, and the child whose fate would haunt Mandela more deeply than almost any other. Born in 1945, Thembi entered a world just beginning to tilt toward open confrontation between black South Africans and the rising architecture of apartheid. He grew up during years when his father balanced a young legal career with an expanding network of political commitments, leaving Thembi to navigate boyhood in a home constantly caught between domestic rhythms and political urgency. Thembi inherited his father's warmth and his mother Evelyn's quiet steadiness. He was gentle but observant, affectionate but thoughtful, and he often served as the emotional center of the household, especially as his parents' marriage began to strain under the pressures of Mandela's activism. For a brief period, before the full storm of apartheid descended, Thembi experienced what could be called ordinary childhood. School, friends, and the sense that family life, though imperfect, was still within reach. But the turning point arrived quickly. When Mandela went underground in 1961 and was later arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964, Thembi was still a teenager. Overnight, he became the eldest son of a man, turned into a symbol, yet one he could no longer touch, see, or confide in. For years he attempted to visit his father, but apartheid regulations made such meetings nearly impossible. Letters were rare, heavily censored, and filled with gaps that only deepened the distance between them. Thembi grew into adulthood with a father behind bars and a country suffocating under the daily violence of institutional racism. The tragedy that defines Thembi's place in the Mandela story occurred on 13th of July, 1969. At only 24, he died in a car accident outside Cape Town, leaving behind a wife and 2 young daughters. The apartheid authorities informed Mandela of his son's death in a cold administrative note delivered on Robben Island. He was not allowed to attend the funeral. He was not allowed to comfort the mother of his grandchildren. He was not allowed even a final look at the child he had once carried on his shoulders. That moment changed Mandela. Years later, he described Thembi's death as a wound that never closed, a private grief buried beneath the rigid discipline expected of political prisoners. Thembi became, in many ways, the symbol of everything Mandela lost in the struggle. The years taken from him, the milestones missed, the embraces denied. His legacy rests not in public accomplishment, but in the emotional truth he forced the world to confront. That liberation, however noble, carried a devastating personal cost. Number 2. Zinzi Mandela. Number 2 is Zinziswa Zinzi Mandela, the youngest daughter of Nelson Mandela and Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, born in 1960 at the very moment South Africa entered its darkest decades. She arrived just as her father went underground, as police raids intensified, and as the apartheid state began to tighten its grip with a brutality that would define her entire childhood. Zinzi did not grow up in a home defined by warmth or routine. She grew up in the middle of a political battlefield. A child whose memories were shaped by boots at the door, whispered warnings, and the sudden disappearances of both parents. While many South African children learned to navigate schoolyards, Zinzi learned to navigate safe houses. When Mandela was arrested and sentenced in 1964, she was only 4. The absence carved into that moment stayed with her for life. She and her older sister Zenani were raised largely by Winnie, whose own activism meant imprisonment, banishment, surveillance, and long periods in solitary confinement. Zinzi became a witness to the cost of resistance at an age when most children were learning their alphabets. Every knock on the door could mean danger. Every goodbye from her mother could be the last for months. Yet Zinzi grew into a fierce, articulate young woman, shaped not by fear, but by defiance. Her turning point arrived in 1985, when she stood before a roaring crowd in Soweto and read her father's historic letter rejecting the apartheid government's conditional offer of release. Nelson Mandela could not speak for himself. He was still behind bars, so his 25-year-old daughter became his voice. In that moment, Zinzi transformed from a child shaped by the struggle into a symbol of it. Her delivery was steady, uncompromising, and unforgettable. It marked her public arrival and signaled a new generation of Mandela resistance. In the years after Mandela's release and the country's transition to democracy, Zinzi pursued a life shaped by diplomacy, literature, and public service. She wrote poetry, acted as a cultural ambassador, and eventually became South Africa's ambassador to Denmark. But beneath those achievements lay the trauma of a childhood spent absorbing the blows aimed at her parents. She carried that weight with candor in later interviews, speaking honestly about the psychological wounds left by exile, raids, and separation. Zinzi Mandela died in 2020 at age 59. Her passing, coming so many years after the formal end of apartheid, was a reminder that the struggle never truly leaves the families who lived through it. She embodied the emotional truth of the Mandela story, that courage is not always a loud declaration, but sometimes a life lived despite the scars. Number 1. Zenani Mandela. Number 1 is Zenani Mandela, Nelson Mandela's first daughter with Winnie Madikizela. Mandela, born in 1959, just months before the Rivonia trial years began to take shape. She entered the world at the edge of an era defined by underground meetings, mounting resistance, and a government that would soon criminalize her father's very existence. Zenani's childhood unfolded not in the comforting rhythms of family life, but in long stretches of separation, uncertainty, and fear. A life suspended between the absence of a father imprisoned for the cause and a mother relentlessly persecuted for refusing to abandon it. Zenani's early years were marked by dislocation. When Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964, she was barely 5 years old. She and her younger sister Zinzi were thrust into a childhood shaped by bannings, police harassment, and the constant threat of exile. Their mother was repeatedly detained, leaving the girls to move between relatives, safe houses, and restricted zones where the state hoped to break Winnie's spirit by destabilizing the lives of her children. Zenani learned early that vulnerability could be dangerous, silence could be strategic, and survival could mean growing up faster than any child should. Her turning point arrived in adolescence, when she was sent abroad for schooling, a decision made to protect her from the chaos surrounding her mother. Zenani attended Waterford cum Laba in Swaziland and later studied in the United States. Distance gave her a perspective few others possessed. She was both deeply connected to the struggle and painfully aware of the cost it exacted on families like her own. She became measured where others were fiery, observant where others were outspoken. It was a temperament that would later make her invaluable in a new South Africa navigating diplomacy rather than rebellion. After Mandela's release and the dawn of democracy, Zenani stepped into public life with a steadiness shaped by years of displacement. She served as South Africa's ambassador to Argentina, then later to Mauritius and South Korea, becoming one of the country's most respected diplomats. Unlike some members of the Mandela family who wrestled publicly with the expectations placed on them, Zenani built her reputation through quiet discipline and a deep understanding of the world beyond South Africa's borders. Her diplomatic career reflected not only personal achievement, but a symbolic shift. From the politics of protest to the politics of statecraft, Zenani's life stands as the most complete arc within Mandela's 6 children. From a childhood overshadowed by repression to adulthood defined by global responsibility. She embodies the transition from struggle to governance, from exile to representation, from inherited trauma to earned authority. Her legacy is not one of speeches or rallies, but of a calm, strategic presence that helped guide South Africa's voice on the international stage. This final chapter closes the story of Mandela's children, 6 lives shaped by a father whose destiny belonged to a nation rather than a home. Through loss, exile, activism, and diplomacy, they carried forward the Mandela name in ways he could never have predicted. Their journeys reveal not only the private cost of public sacrifice, but the remarkable strength of a family that lived both inside and beyond history. The story of Nelson Mandela's 6 children is not a simple extension of their father's legend. It is a landscape shaped by sacrifice, distance, resilience, and, at times, irreparable loss. Each child carried a different fragment of the struggle, a name that opened doors for some, a burden that weighed heavily on others, and an inheritance defined as much by absence as by pride. Their lives reveal the emotional truth behind the public myth, that even the most heroic victories cast long, complicated shadows at home. Mandela spent 27 years in prison, fighting for a nation's freedom. But those years left empty chairs at school concerts, silent places at dinner tables, and questions his children learned not to ask. Some grew into leaders in their own right, stepping into diplomacy, business, or public service. Others lived and died quietly, shaped not by politics, but by the ordinary, often painful realities of family life under oppression. And some were lost before they ever had the chance to grow. Reminders that history's great movements are carried on the backs of families asked to bear far more than the world ever sees. Yet, taken together, the children of Nelson Mandela form a portrait of persistence. They survived exile, surveillance, fractured homes, and global expectations. They endured the weight of a father claimed by millions, but absent from their daily lives. And still, in different ways, they found paths of their own, some public, some private, all touched by the long struggle that shaped South Africa's destiny. Their stories ask us to look past the statues and speeches, past the triumphant walk out of prison, and to remember the quieter truths. That freedom has a price, that leadership is never solitary, and that even the greatest icons leave behind wounds that history must reckon with. In the end, the Mandela children did not all become symbols, but they all became witnesses to a father transformed into an idea, to a nation transformed by sacrifice, and to the enduring complexity of a legacy carried not only in the spotlight, but in the shadows it leaves behind.